The city of Rome hums with restless energy. Senators in flowing white togas gather in hushed groups, exchanging glances weighted with unspoken intent. The Senate chamber awaits, its towering columns casting long shadows over the cold marble floor. It is the 15th day of March and fate has already been decided. Julius Caesar strides through the forum, his crimson-edged toga flowing behind him. He is at the height of his power, dictator for life, ruler of Rome in all but name. The people adore him. His legions would die for him. But in the corridors of power, jealousy festers. Senators, once allies, now whisper of tyranny. A soothsayer steps forward from the crowd, his voice strained with urgency. "Beware the Ides of March," he warns. Caesar scoffs, his confidence unwavering. He has defied death too many times to heed the words of mystics. He pushes forward toward the Senate chamber, where men who once praised him now clutch hidden daggers beneath their robes. The doors close behind him. A voice calls his name. He turns, only to feel a sharp, searing pain in his side. A second strike, then a third. The betrayal unfolds in brutal silence. He staggers, his strength failing him, until he sees a familiar face. Brutus, his friend, his protégé. "Et tu, brute?" With those words, Julius Caesar falls. The greatest man in Rome, undone not by a foreign army, but by the very hands that once lifted him in praise. His blood seeps into the marble. Rome will never be the same again. Julius Caesar was born on July 12, 100 BC in the heart of Rome, a city that was both the pinnacle of civilization and a hotbed of political strife. His family, the Julii, was one of the oldest patrician houses, tracing its lineage back to the goddess Venus through the Trojan hero Aeneas. Yet, despite this noble ancestry, the Julii had little real power in the cutthroat world of Roman politics. They were respected, but not feared, influential, but not dominant. This was the Rome Caesar was born into, a world where names meant less than ambition, and only those willing to seize power could hope to wield it. His father, Gaius Julius Caesar, was a praetor, a middle-ranking magistrate who governed provinces and held some influence within the Senate. His mother, Aurelia Cotta, was of an equally distinguished lineage, but it was her intellect and discipline that would shape Caesar more than anything else. Unlike many Roman aristocrats who left the raising of their children to Greek tutors and slaves, Aurelia played an active role in her son's education. She instilled in him a love for oratory, philosophy, and military history. Even as a child, Caesar was observant, watching, listening, absorbing the ruthless power struggles that played out in the Senate. He learned early that in Rome, power was taken, not given. During Caesar's childhood, Rome was in a state of near-constant chaos. The Republic, once the great pride of Rome, was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. The Optimates, the conservative faction of the Senate, sought to preserve the status quo, keeping power in the hands of the aristocracy. Opposing them were the Populares, who advocated for reforms that would benefit the common people and weaken the Senate's grip on power. Amid this growing conflict, a single figure loomed over Rome, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. A ruthless general and politician, Sulla became dictator in 82 BC after a brutal civil war against his rival Gaius Marius. His reign was marked by the proscription lists, a terrifying system in which his enemies were declared outlaws, their property confiscated, and their lives forfeit. Thousands of political opponents were executed, their wealth absorbed by Sulla's allies. Caesar, despite his youth, was not merely an observer in this conflict. His uncle, Gaius Marius, had been Sulla's greatest enemy, a champion of the Populares. This put the young Caesar in immediate danger when Sulla seized control of Rome. At the age of 16, Caesar suffered a devastating loss. His father died suddenly, leaving him as the head of his family. At such a young age, this was both an immense responsibility and an incredible danger. In Rome, power was fleeting, and enemies lurked in every shadow. To secure his future, Caesar was betrothed to Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a staunch ally of Marius and a sworn enemy of Sulla. It was a politically charged marriage, tying him to the faction that Sulla had sworn to destroy. When Sulla consolidated his power, he demanded that Caesar divorce Cornelia to sever his ties to the opposition. Many others in Caesar's position would have complied, seeing it as a necessary sacrifice for survival. But Caesar, even as a teenager, was not one to surrender his principles or his pride. He flatly refused. Sulla was enraged. Few defied him and lived. He stripped Caesar of his inheritance, confiscated his family's properties, and placed his name on the proscription lists. With no wealth, no protection, and enemies on every side, Caesar was forced into hiding, constantly moving from place to place to avoid capture. It was only through the intervention of his mother's family, particularly the powerful influence of the Vestals virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses, that Sulla was persuaded to spare his life. But even in granting this mercy, Sulla ominously remarked, "In this young man, I see many a Marius." It was a prophecy of what was to come. Stripped of his inheritance and unwelcome in Rome, Caesar had no choice but to flee. He left the city in 81 BC, travelling eastward to serve in the military, a common path for young Roman nobles seeking to rebuild their reputations. He was stationed in Asia Minor under Marcus Minucius Thermus, the governor of Bithynia. It was here that Caesar first proved his brilliance on the battlefield. During the siege of Mytilene, a campaign against rebellious Greek forces, Caesar played a key role in securing victory. For his courage in battle, he was awarded the Civic Crown, a rare and prestigious military decoration given only to those who had personally saved the lives of fellow Roman soldiers in combat. Even in the ranks of the Roman army, Caesar's name began to spread. With his military service complete, Caesar set out for Rhodes to study oratory under the renowned Greek teacher Apollonius Molon. But fate had other plans. While sailing the Aegean, Caesar's ship was intercepted by a band of Cilician pirates, notorious for their cruelty and lawlessness. They captured him, unaware of who they had taken. The pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, a fortune, but one that could be raised for a nobleman of Caesar's status. Rather than cowering in fear, Caesar laughed at their demand. He declared that they had undervalued him and insisted they raise the ransom to 50 talents. Amused by his arrogance, the pirates agreed, but during his captivity, Caesar did not act like a hostage. He treated the pirates as if they were his subordinates, demanding they provide him with better food, silencing them when he wanted to sleep, and even jokingly promising that once freed he would hunt them down and crucify them all. The pirates, thinking him harmless, laughed. They did not realize he was deadly serious. As soon as his ransom was paid, Caesar wasted no time. He raised a fleet, pursued the pirates, and captured them all. Keeping true to his word, he ordered them crucified, but in an act of calculated mercy, he had their throats slit first to spare them unnecessary suffering. This episode was not just an act of vengeance, it was a statement. Caesar had returned to the world stage, and he would not be forgotten. By the time Caesar returned to Rome in 73 BC, he had transformed from a fugitive into a war-hardened commander with a growing reputation. He entered politics, quickly rising through the ranks as a powerful orator and populist leader. Unlike the aristocratic elites who sneered at the common people, Caesar embraced them, delivering fiery speeches, proposing reforms, and positioning himself as a champion of the Roman masses. His path was set. He would rise through the Republic, seize the reins of power, and reshape Rome in his image. But Rome was not ready for him. Not yet. A storm was coming, and Julius Caesar would be at its center. By the time Julius Caesar was appointed governor of Gaul in 58 BC, he was already an exceptional politician, orator, and rising military leader. But in Rome, political power alone was not enough. A man's reputation, legacy, and authority were forged in the fires of conquest. Caesar understood that if he wanted to dominate Rome, he needed to conquer new lands, amass wealth, and build a fiercely loyal army. Gaul, a vast and untamed land to the north, was the perfect stage for his ambition. Though Rome had nominal control over some Gallic territories, the land was far from truly conquered. The Gauls were not a single unified people, but a collection of fiercely independent tribes. each with its own customs, leaders, and warriors. Some were allies of Rome, others were bitter enemies, but none of them truly understood what was coming. Caesar, in his own writings, would later justify his campaign by claiming it was a defensive war, a necessity to protect Rome's northern borders from barbarian incursions. But the truth was far more calculated. Gaul was his ticket to ultimate power. Before Caesar could set foot in Gaul, he had to secure his political position in Rome. Unlike later emperors, he did not have the luxury of ruling by decree. He had to manipulate the republican system to his advantage. In 60 BC, he formed the First Triumvirate, an informal alliance with two of Rome's most powerful men: Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general; Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. The deal was simple. Pompey and Crassus would help Caesar secure the powerful proconsulship of Gaul, and in return, he would use his influence to push their political agendas forward in Rome. By 58 BC, Caesar had outmaneuvered his rivals and taken control of Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, Transalpine Gaul, southern France, and Illyricum, the Balkans. But these were just stepping stones. His real ambition lay beyond Rome's existing borders. He wanted all of Gaul. His excuse for war came sooner than expected. The first challenge to Caesar's authority came from the Helvetii, a powerful Gallic tribe from modern-day Switzerland. Pressured by Germanic invasions and seeking better lands, the Helvetii began a massive migration, nearly 400,000 men, women, and children, along with cattle, wagons, and supplies. Their movement threatened to destabilize the region. Caesar, always the strategist, saw an opportunity. He claimed the Helvetii were a danger to Rome's Gallic allies and ordered them to halt their migration and seek permission from Rome. This was not a genuine request. It was a trap. He knew they would refuse. When the Helvetii ignored his demand, Caesar acted swiftly. He blocked their path at the Rhone River, forcing them to seek an alternate route through Gaul. Then he pursued them relentlessly, refusing to allow them safe passage. At the Battle of Bibracte, Caesar's legions met the Helvetii in open battle. Though outnumbered, he used superior discipline and clever formations to counter their relentless charges. The fighting was brutal. Hand to hand, shields splintering, swords slashing through flesh. By nightfall, tens of thousands lay dead. The Helvetii, utterly defeated, surrendered. Caesar forced the survivors to return to their lands under Rome's supervision, ensuring they would never rise again. With this victory, Caesar had established his dominance in Gaul, but an even greater threat loomed on the horizon. No sooner had the Helvetii been crushed than a new enemy emerged, one even more terrifying than the Gallic tribes. Ariovistus, a Germanic warlord, had crossed the Rhine River with thousands of warriors, claiming land deep inside Gaul. His presence was a direct challenge to both Rome and the Gallic chieftains who had long feared Germanic expansion. Caesar attempted diplomacy. He summoned Ariovistus for a meeting, hoping to intimidate him into leaving. The warlord, massive and battle-scarred, refused to back down. He scoffed at Caesar's authority, claiming that he, not Rome, was the rightful ruler of Gaul. Caesar wasted no time. He mobilized his forces, pursued Ariovistus into the Vosges Mountains, and engaged his warriors in one of the most vicious battles of the campaign. The Germans fought with ferocity unlike anything the Romans had faced before, howling war cries, wielding massive longswords, charging in tight wedge formations designed to break through Roman lines. Caesar's troops, disciplined and battle-hardened, stood firm. After hours of savage combat, the Roman cavalry outflanked Ariovistus's army, cutting them off from retreat. The German king barely escaped with his life, fleeing back across the Rhine. For now, the Germanic threat was neutralized, and Caesar's power in Gaul was absolute. But the war was far from over. For years, Rome's conquest of Gaul continued tribe by tribe, battle by battle. But in 52 BC, a true leader emerged to unite the Gallic people. His name was Vercingetorix, a young but brilliant chieftain of the Arverni tribe. Vercingetorix understood something no other Gallic leader had before. Rome could not be beaten in open battle. Instead of trying to match Roman discipline, he waged a war of attrition. He ordered Gallic tribes to burn their own villages, destroy crops, and deny Rome any supplies. For the first time, Caesar found himself fighting an enemy he could not easily crush. His supply lines stretched thin. His men grew weary. And then, the decisive moment arrived. Vercingetorix retreated to the fortress city of Alesia, believing he could withstand a Roman siege. Caesar saw his chance. He ordered his men to build a massive wall, 11 miles long, encircling Alesia, trapping Vercingetorix and his forces inside. But he did not stop there. Anticipating a Gallic relief army, he built a second wall, facing outward, turning his own position into an impenetrable fortress. When the Gallic reinforcements, nearly 250,000 warriors, arrived, the Romans were trapped between the enemy inside Alesia and an even larger force outside. The final battle began. For days, the Gauls launched wave after wave of attacks, testing every inch of Roman defences. At one point, Caesar's men were nearly overwhelmed, but in a final, desperate manoeuvre, Caesar personally led a cavalry charge into the enemy's weakest flank. The bold move shattered the Gallic morale. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix saw the writing on the wall. He rode out, dismounted before Caesar, and threw his sword at his feet. The war was over. By 50 BC, Julius Caesar was the most powerful man in Rome, at least in military terms. His conquest of Gaul had made him immensely wealthy, and his legions were fanatically loyal to him. But his enemies in the Senate, led by Pompey the Great, saw him as an existential threat. The Republic had long relied on a delicate balance of power between ambitious generals, senators, and magistrates. No single man was meant to dominate the system, but Caesar was now poised to do just that. The Senate, heavily influenced by the Optimates, the conservative elite class of Rome, feared he would become a dictator like Sulla. Pompey, who had once been Caesar's closest ally, was now his greatest rival. Though once considered Rome's finest general, Pompey's military reputation had been overshadowed by Caesar's brilliant campaigns in Gaul. Jealousy and fear drove their relationship into open hostility. In late 50 BC, the Senate issued a decree. Caesar must disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. If he refused, he would be declared an enemy of the Republic. Caesar understood what this meant. If he entered Rome without his legions, he would be arrested, stripped of power, and possibly executed. He sent a counteroffer, proposing that both he and Pompey disarm simultaneously to prevent a civil war. The Senate rejected it. His fate had been decided for him. If Caesar wanted to survive, he had only one choice. He had to march on Rome. On a cold January night, Julius Caesar stood at the edge of the Rubicon River, the small but symbolically immense boundary between Cisalpine Gaul and Italy. Behind him, his 13th Legion, hardened from years of brutal warfare, awaited his command. To cross the Rubicon with an army was an act of treason. It was a direct declaration of war against the Senate and Pompey. For a brief moment, Caesar hesitated. He knew the weight of what he was about to do. Then, with absolute conviction, he turned to his men and spoke, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. With that, he led his legions across the Rubicon, signaling the beginning of the Roman Civil War. The news of Caesar's invasion spread like wildfire. Pompey, the Senate, and the Optimates had expected Caesar to comply with their demands, not to challenge the entire Republic. Panic swept through Rome. Pompey, despite his years of military service, was unprepared. He had expected to raise legions easily, but most of the troops in Italy were either loyal to Caesar or unwilling to fight for the Senate. Realizing that he could not hold the city, Pompey and the Senate abandoned Rome, fleeing south to Brundisium, a major port city. From there, he and his forces escaped by sea to Greece, where he planned to gather an even greater army. Caesar entered Rome unopposed. The city was his, but he knew the war had only just begun. Pompey still controlled vast resources, including the wealth of the eastern provinces. If Caesar wanted to secure his rule, he had to defeat Pompey completely. After securing Italy, Caesar turned his forces towards Spain, where Pompey's generals were still active. He crushed them in a swift campaign, cutting off Pompey's access to reinforcements from the west. Then, in 48 BC, Caesar set sail for Greece, determined to end the war by confronting Pompey directly. Pompey had raised an army twice the size of Caesar's, consisting of 50,000 Roman veterans, thousands of cavalry, and a powerful navy. His forces were well-fed, well-equipped, and dug into strong defensive positions along the Adriatic coast. Caesar's situation was dire. His army was outnumbered, and his supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. His first attempt at breaking through Pompey's defenses at Dyrrhachium failed. Pompey's forces repelled him, forcing Caesar into retreat. For the first time, Caesar faced the real possibility of defeat, but Pompey did not capitalize on his advantage. He believed that he had already won and decided to wait for Caesar's forces to collapse from lack of supplies. This gave Caesar a crucial opportunity to regroup, outmaneuver Pompey, and set the stage for a decisive battle. On August 9th, 48 BC, the two greatest generals of the age met on the plains of Pharsalus in central Greece. Pompey's 50,000 troops vastly outnumbered Caesar's 22,000. He had 7,000 cavalry to Caesar's 1,000. Everything suggested that Pompey should win. But Caesar was a master of psychological warfare and battlefield tactics. He knew Pompey's strategy. Pompey planned to use his superior cavalry to outflank Caesar's smaller force, forcing a retreat. Caesar anticipated this and set a trap. As Pompey's cavalry charged, Caesar's hidden fourth battle line, made up of elite soldiers, emerged and counterattacked. They drove their spears directly into the horses' faces, throwing Pompey's entire flank into chaos. With his cavalry routed, Pompey's army collapsed. His troops fled in panic, and by the end of the battle, 15,000 of his men lay dead, while another 20,000 surrendered. Pompey himself barely escaped, fleeing to Egypt, hoping to find safety. But instead of sanctuary, he found betrayal. When Pompey landed in Egypt, he sought the protection of Ptolemy XIII, the boy king of Egypt. But Ptolemy and his advisors saw an opportunity to win Caesar's favor. As Pompey stepped onto the shore, he was stabbed to death by his own supposed allies. His head was severed and presented to Caesar when he arrived in Alexandria. Caesar, though his enemy was dead, was disgusted by the act. He refused to look at Pompey's severed head and instead wept for his fallen rival. He ordered that Pompey be given a proper Roman funeral, a final sign of respect for the man who had once ruled alongside him. With Pompey dead, Caesar was now the undisputed ruler of Rome, but his time in Egypt was far from over. Egypt was in the midst of a civil war between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra, realizing that Caesar could determine the fate of Egypt, had herself smuggled into his palace, wrapped in a carpet. When the carpet was unrolled before him, she emerged offering him her loyalty and more. Caesar, recognizing both her intelligence and political value, backed Cleopatra's claim to the throne. But Ptolemy XIII refused to surrender. The result was the siege of Alexandria, where Caesar and Cleopatra were trapped inside the royal palace for months, under siege by the pharaoh's forces. The great library of Alexandria was partially burned in the conflict. Only after reinforcements arrived did Caesar break the siege. Ptolemy XIII was drowned in the Nile, and Cleopatra took the throne as Queen of Egypt, with Caesar as her lover. She bore him a son, Ptolemy XV, known as Caesarion. But Caesar could not stay in Egypt forever. His true destiny lay in Rome. Though Pompey was dead, the remnants of the senatorial resistance continued to fight. Caesar crushed them at the Battle of Thapsus, 46 BC, in North Africa, forcing Cato the Younger to commit suicide. His final campaign was in Spain, where Pompey's sons led one last rebellion. At the Battle of Munda, 45 BC, Caesar barely won, but it marked the end of the civil war. Now, he was dictator for life. But in Rome, his fate was already being decided. By 45 BC, Julius Caesar had defeated every last remnant of the Republican resistance. He had crushed Pompey's armies in Greece and Spain, had chased down and eliminated the remaining senators who opposed him, and had returned to Rome as the most powerful man in the Republic's history. With no one left to challenge him, he became the first man to hold absolute power over Rome without opposition. But while the streets of Rome were filled with cheering citizens and adoring veterans, the Senate was filled with resentment, jealousy, and fear. Though he was officially still only dictator perpetuo, Many believed that he had de facto made himself a king, a title that Romans hated with a passion. Caesar was a master of both war and politics. He knew that if he wanted to keep his power, he had to win over the people while keeping the Senate weak. His most radical reforms included expanding the Senate from 600 to 900 members, filling it with his loyal supporters, many of whom were not of traditional aristocratic birth, granting Roman citizenship to more people in Italy and the provinces, ensuring that millions of people across the empire were personally invested in his rule, redistributing land to veterans and the poor, weakening the power of the aristocratic elite, eliminating political rivals, either through appointments to powerless positions or, when necessary, quiet assassination. To many, these changes were bold and progressive, ushering Rome into a new era of centralized power. But to his enemies, these were clear signs of tyranny. The tension between Caesar's rule and Rome's hatred of kingship came to a breaking point during the Lupercalia festival in February 44 BC. The Lupercalia was an ancient pagan festival of fertility, where men ran through the streets striking women with goat-hide whips, a ritual believed to increase fertility. But this year, something happened that had nothing to do with ancient traditions, something that sent shockwaves through the Senate. During the festivities, Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal general, stepped forward before the gathered masses. In his hands, he carried a golden crown, a symbol of monarchy. Before the entire city, Antony offered the crown to Caesar. For a moment, all of Rome held its breath. Would he take it? Would he place the crown upon his head and declare himself king? Caesar waved the crown away, refusing it, but only after a noticeable hesitation. The crowd cheered, but some noticed a flicker of uncertainty in Caesar's face. Then, Antony offered it a second time. Caesar refused again, but some began to suspect that this was a test. Was he gauging the reaction of the people? Was this a staged event to see if they would accept him as king? To the common people, this display affirmed Caesar's humility. He was rejecting kingship, proving that he ruled only for the good of Rome. But to the senators, this was the final proof that he was plotting to become king. If they waited any longer, he would declare himself a monarch and end the republic forever. The decision was made. Julius Caesar had to die. The plot to kill Caesar was not a rebellion of the people. It was a conspiracy by Rome's old elite, the aristocratic senators who had once ruled the republic unchallenged. Leading the conspiracy were two men, Marcus Junius Brutus, a senator of impeccable lineage. He was the adopted son of Cato the Younger, a fierce defender of the republic who had committed suicide rather than live under Caesar's rule. Many believed that Caesar treated Brutus like a son, which made Brutus's betrayal all the more shocking. Gaius Cassius Longinus, a hardened general and unrelenting enemy of Caesar. He had fought for Pompey in the Civil War and had never forgiven Caesar for destroying the Republic. Together, they gathered over 60 senators, all of whom feared that Caesar would soon strip them of their power permanently. But there was one problem. Caesar was always surrounded by his bodyguards. Assassinating him in public would be impossible. They needed to lure him into a place where he would be alone, surrounded only by senators. That place was the Senate chamber. Caesar had been warned. A soothsayer had told him days before, "Beware the Ides of March." His wife, Calpurnia, had a nightmare the night before the assassination. She saw Caesar's body covered in blood and begged him not to go to the Senate. A senator loyal to him, Servilius Casca, even tried to warn him on his way to the Senate. As Caesar prepared to leave his house on the morning of March 15th, he hesitated. For the first time, he considered not going. But Decimus Brutus, a key conspirator, arrived at his home and mocked him. He said that if Caesar refused to appear before the Senate, the senators would think he was weak and afraid. Caesar, prideful as ever, refused to let them believe he was a coward. Ignoring all the warnings, he set out for the Senate. Fate had already been sealed. As Caesar entered the theatre of Pompey where the Senate was meeting, the conspirators were already in position. They had hidden daggers beneath their togas, waiting for the signal. Caesar sat in his chair, preparing for the session to begin. Suddenly, Tullius Cimber, one of the conspirators, approached Caesar, pretending to plead for his exiled brother's return. As Caesar turned him away, Simba grabbed Caesar's toga, the signal to attack. Cassius was the first to strike, stabbing Caesar in the chest. Then all hell broke loose. More senators rushed forward, their daggers flashing in the candlelight. Caesar, despite being wounded, fought back at first, trying to push them away, but there were too many. Then, through the chaos, he saw Brutus, the man he trusted, the man he loved like a son. Brutus raised his dagger. Caesar stopped resisting. His final words, "Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus?" With that, he pulled his toga over his head, accepting his fate. The senators stabbed him a total of 23 times, though historians believe only one wound was truly fatal. Julius Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, the master of Rome, the man who had reshaped history, was dead. The senators who had just taken part in the assassination stood frozen, staring at the corpse of the most powerful man Rome had ever known. For a moment, there was only silence. The conspirators, who had expected applause, celebration, even relief from their peers, realized that they had badly miscalculated. As the moments passed, a few senators who had not been part of the conspiracy began slipping away, fleeing from the chamber, afraid of what was to come. Then, the panic set in. Brutus, still gripping his bloody dagger, was the first to try and calm the room. "We have saved the Republic," he declared. "Rome is free once more." But there was no celebration, no applause. Instead, some senators began rushing toward the exits, desperate to leave before anyone realized they had been present. The conspirators, suddenly realizing that they no longer controlled the situation, grabbed their weapons and fled the Senate building. As they ran through the streets of Rome, their white togas stained red, a few people called out to them, asking, "What have you done?" Others hid in their homes, refusing to involve themselves in what was clearly an act of treason. The conspirators had assumed that Caesar's death would be the end of the struggle. Instead, it was only the beginning of an even greater war. For years, Caesar had cultivated an almost godlike status among the Roman people. To them, he was not just a general. He was a leader who had defied the corrupt Senate, given them land and food, and promised them a better future. When word of his assassination spread, Rome erupted into confusion and grief. At first, many Romans refused to believe it was true. Then, as more and more people confirmed it, shock turned to rage. By nightfall, violent mobs filled the streets, calling for vengeance against the assassins. The conspirators had not prepared for this reaction. They had assumed that by removing Caesar, they would restore order and bring back the old republic. But the common people had loved Caesar too much to let his death go unanswered. As the night wore on, riots erupted across the city. Angry citizens dragged statues of Caesar through the streets, covering them in flowers and weeping openly in public. They stormed the homes of known conspirators, setting them on fire. Brutus, Cassius, and the other assassins had to flee for their lives, taking refuge in the capital, where they locked themselves inside, terrified of the fury they had unleashed. While the conspirators hid, Mark Antony, Caesar's closest ally and co-consul, took action. Antony had not been part of the conspiracy, but he understood power better than anyone. He realized that whoever controlled Caesar's legacy would control Rome. That night, Antony gathered Caesar's most loyal soldiers and supporters, quickly seizing control of the city's treasury, government buildings, and armories. By the following morning, the Senate had no choice but to recognize Antony as the highest authority in Rome. The conspirators, now outmaneuvered, sent messengers to negotiate a peace deal, claiming that the assassination had been for the good of Rome. Antony pretended to listen. But he had other plans. The turning point came when Antony seized Caesar's will. On March 20th, 44 BC, just 5 days after his assassination, Caesar's funeral was held in the Forum Romanum. It was one of the most pivotal moments in Roman history. The conspirators had wanted a quiet, controlled ceremony, something that would allow them to maintain order and avoid further riots. But Antony had no intention of letting that happen. He turned the funeral into a spectacle of grief, rage, and political theatre. Tens of thousands of Romans gathered in the Forum, many carrying images of Caesar, some wearing black in mourning, others shouting for revenge. When Antony took the stage, he began by speaking calmly, praising Brutus, Cassius, and the other conspirators as honorable men. He repeated this phrase again and again, slowly building sarcasm and anger into his voice. Then, he revealed Caesar's will. The will stated that every Roman citizen would receive a sum of 300 sesterces, a massive gift of wealth. Caesar's private gardens and land would be given to the people of Rome. The crowd gasped. Many began sobbing, realizing that Caesar had planned to give them everything, and now he was dead. Finally, Antony lifted up Caesar's blood-stained toga, showing the people where each of the conspirators had stabbed him. The sight of it was too much to bear. The Roman people erupted into uncontrollable rage. The funeral turned into a full-scale riot. That night, the Senate House was set on fire, and mobs began hunting down anyone suspected of being involved in the assassination. The conspirators fled the city, realizing that they had lost Rome forever. While Antony was securing control of Rome, a new player entered the game, Caesar's heir. In his will, Caesar had officially adopted his 19-year-old great-nephew, Gaius Octavius, making him his legal successor. At first, no one took Octavian seriously. He was young, inexperienced, and unknown to most of Rome. The Senate and Antony both assumed he would be easy to manipulate, but Octavian was far more cunning than anyone expected. Upon arriving in Rome, he began gathering an army, using Caesar's name and fortune to win over soldiers and politicians. Within months, he had transformed from an unknown teenager into one of the most powerful men in Rome. By 43 BC, he forced the Senate to recognize him as consul, and shortly after, he formed the Second Triumvirate, an alliance between himself, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, with one goal: to hunt down and eliminate every last assassin. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, had fled Rome and regrouped in the eastern provinces. They had raised a massive army, nearly 100,000 troops, consisting of Republican loyalists, exiled senators, and mercenaries. But they were up against the combined might of Octavian and Antony, who commanded a force of over 100,000 Roman veterans, men who had fought under Caesar himself. The final showdown came in 42 BC at the Battle of Philippi. It was a bloody and brutal battle, fought in two major engagements. Cassius was the first to fall. Believing his forces had been defeated, he committed suicide on the battlefield, unaware that his troops had actually been winning. Brutus fought on, but his forces were eventually surrounded and destroyed. Realizing all hope was lost, he fell on his own sword, ending the last resistance to Caesar's rule. With their deaths, the old republic was officially dead. Caesar's assassins were gone. But Rome's civil wars were not over yet. Octavian and Antony now turned against each other, leading to another war that would end with Octavian becoming the first emperor of Rome. By 31 BC, Octavian had defeated Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium. In 27 BC, he took the title Augustus, becoming the first emperor of Rome. Julius Caesar had died, but his dream of an empire ruled by one man had come true. Rome belonged to him, and his name would be remembered for eternity. Julius Caesar was more than just a military leader, a politician, or a reformer. He was a man whose ambition, intellect, and strategic genius reshaped the course of world history. His rise to power, his assassination, and the resulting transformation of Rome not only ended the Republic, but laid the foundation for an empire that would dominate the world for centuries. Even after his death, Caesar's legacy continued to grow, influencing leaders, philosophers, military strategists, and historians across generations. His name became a symbol of absolute power, ambition, and political mastery, a name that would echo throughout history long after Rome itself had fallen. But what exactly did he leave behind, and how did his actions shape the world? For nearly 5 centuries, the Roman Republic had functioned as a government ruled by a complex system of checks and balances. No single individual was supposed to dominate. Instead, power was divided between elected officials, magistrates, the Senate, and the Roman people. But by the time Caesar rose to power, the Republic was already in decline. The Senate had become corrupt, filled with aristocrats who cared more about their personal wealth than the welfare of Rome. The people of Rome had grown tired of ineffective rule and saw generals like Caesar, who provided land, wealth, and military victories, as their true leaders. The legions, once loyal to Rome itself, had become loyal to their generals, setting the stage for military takeovers. Caesar did not destroy the Republic. He simply proved that it was already broken. His assassination was supposed to restore the Republic, but instead, it only accelerated its downfall. With no clear leader, Rome descended into chaos, leading to years of brutal civil war. By the time peace was restored, the Republic was gone, replaced by a centralized imperial government under Caesar's heir, Augustus. Caesar had paved the way for Rome's first emperor, even if he never lived to see it. Perhaps the greatest testament to Caesar's influence was his adopted heir, Gaius Octavius, who would later take the name Augustus. Augustus, despite being only 19 years old at the time of Caesar's death, quickly proved himself a master of political strategy. Using Caesar's name and legacy, he rallied an army, eliminated the conspirators, and positioned himself as Rome's next great leader. In 27 BC, he formally became Rome's first emperor, ending the Republic forever. Augustus was not a military genius like Caesar, but he was a political mastermind. He learned from his adoptive father's mistakes, avoiding the open dictatorship that had led to Caesar's downfall. Instead, he kept the illusion of the Republic alive while holding absolute power behind the scenes. Without Caesar, Augustus would never have risen to power. Without Augustus, the Roman Empire would never have existed. Caesar did not live to see his empire rise, but it was built entirely in his image. Before Caesar, Roman citizenship was tightly restricted, often reserved only for people born in Rome or from elite families. Caesar expanded citizenship to people across Italy, Gaul, and Spain, recognizing that Rome's future lay in uniting its vast empire under one identity. This helped integrate conquered peoples into Roman society, making them loyal to Rome rather than rebellious subjects. Later emperors continued this policy, eventually granting citizenship to nearly all free men in the empire by 212 AD. This move strengthened Rome, making it more than just a city. It became a civilization. Caesar was not just a conqueror, he was a reformer who sought to improve Rome's economy and governance. He redistributed land to veterans, ensuring that soldiers had a livelihood after service. He reduced corruption, reforming how governors collected taxes to prevent abuse. He increased the pay of soldiers, ensuring their loyalty to him, a strategy later used by emperors to maintain control over the legions. These reforms created a stronger, more centralized Rome, one that would survive for centuries under imperial rule. The debate over Caesar's true nature has never ended. To his supporters, he was a visionary leader who modernized Rome, expanded its influence, and sought to help the common people. To his enemies, he was a dictator who destroyed the Republic, centralizing power in himself for his own ambition. But one thing is beyond debate. Julius Caesar was not just another Roman leader. He was a force of history, one that reshaped the world forever. Julius Caesar died at the hands of his enemies, but in the end, he won. His name became eternal. His empire rose. His vision shaped the world. Over 2,000 years later, his story is still studied, told, and remembered. Julius Caesar never truly died. He became history itself.